Hello and welcome to Diabolic. I am Edgar Wiltrose.
And I am the co-host, Walter Sims.
And we're pleased to be back with you, our loyal audience, after a long hiatus due to various legal issues that we are not allowed to discuss at this present point in time.
All I can say is the fact that it was quite a long and drawn-out process, and we were in dispute with BBC Radio 4, our former employer.
Yes, but that, you could say, is water under the bridge at this point. However, we're pleased to be recording from a bespoke studio in North London, and we are happy to be releasing this podcast, Diabolic. Walter, I think it's time for you to introduce yourself.
So I am Walter Sims, as I said. I am a clinical psychologist at the London Research University. My role is the co-coordinator of the London Research Unit.
You've also had some work in TV as well, haven't you?
Yes, so a bit of Jeremy Carlisle was the psychologist on that. They would come and see me. Also Big Brother. I would also be on Big Brother's Little Brother doing some of the analysis work there and sort of providing a psychological viewpoint and looking at it from that lens.
Fantastic.
And how about yourself?
Well, long-time listeners of the show may well remember the both of us, but for those who are new to the show, I am Edgar Wiltrose and I'm an analyst. I think now we ought to introduce the podcast itself.
Of course, yes. So what we do on Diabolic is we analyse chiefly 90s British children's television that ran on CBBC. We look at it through various different lenses. We use different paradigms, different approaches, and analyse the work that was produced and something that we grew up with as well.
Yeah, a lot of these children's television programmes are these oft forgotten cultural artefacts that deserve to be scrutinised and hopefully appreciated at a deeper level than you may initially remember from your Saturday mornings with your cornflakes on your lap.
I found, when you re-explore some of the work, you realise that it had many sort of deeper meanings as a child that you would have missed, but now as an adult, you're kind of rediscovering the work and looking at it and enjoying it a second time.
Yeah, and I think that really brings us on to a real favourite of ours. Today we are pleased to be discussing and in conversation with the seminal work Bodger and Badger.
Yes, so Bodger and Badger was first aired in 1989. Can you believe that?
Incredible.
Yeah, and it ran all the way until 2006. It was the work of Andrew Cunningham. He was a master ventriloquist. He actually dropped out of Cambridge University to pursue a career as a ventriloquist in children's television, believe it or not. And
I think we remember him largely for his role as Simon Bodger in Bodger and Badger. However, I think throughout all of his work, he consistently proves that he's not a mere puppeteer.
No. And one thing we will touch on is the fact that we would sort of describe a lot of Bodger and or Badger as a semi-autobiographical work.
Certainly, and that's something that we. So this Cunningham, is he Bodger, and to what extent is he Badger? And we will be talking about all of these minor details today. Largely, this will be through a Marxist lens. We'll be exploring the possibility of chauvinism, and of course, I think this will be chiefly led by Walter here, but a psychoanalytical perspective.
Yeah. There's a lot going on with it, especially when you reanalyse the work and you really see what he was trying to portray, perhaps and it really reflects on his mental state. It's really interesting when you kind of look at the work.
And I think before we move into these minor segments, the one thing that I think is most important when observing Bodger and or Badger is the fact that he adopted the badger as his familiar, as his associate. And I think that you can see in its stripes there is this certain demand for deeper meaning, by which I mean there are so many hidden subtexts in Cunningham's work, particularly in Bodger and Badger, and when looking at this piece, you shouldn't read between the lines, but much like a badger, you must read between its stripes.
Yeah, that's very, very true there, and that's one thing I've been trying to do now when I rewatch it, and when we've done it, it's really interesting. At this point in the podcast, we would like to take a look at Bodger and Badger as a show, some of the, describe some of the themes, some of the main characters that were kind of popping in and out of the show and appearing in his life. We will do that through a Marxist perspective. And firstly, Edgar, I guess, would you just please give me a taste of his CV, Simon Bodger?
Yes, so Simon Bodger is the titular character of Bodger and Badger, a middle-aged man who is constantly accompanied by a badger, seemingly only named Badger. The reason why we bring his CV into question is because much of the show consists of Simon Bodger drifting from job to job, from menial role to menial role, and largely he finds himself falling out of employment due to his penchant for mashed potato.
Yeah, a lot of what I remember is a lot of self-sabotage, whether it be Badger or himself, his own sort of antics and behaviour, kind of, upsetting people or sometimes getting him into scrapes, basically.
Yeah, of course, people rarely enjoy the sensation of mashed potato whipped across their face.
No, and I do, as you said, I do largely remember him being sort of neat, i.e. not in employment, education or training throughout some of the show at least.
In fact, as a brief aside, Walter and I have been discussing prior to the podcast as to whether Simon Bodger can actually read.
Yeah, we never see him with a book. I know that much, and he's always quite confused in public situations, and that might explain some of his sort of haphazard behaviour and perhaps why he can't hold a job.
Yes, and also if we just return to the possibly the most consistent, or perhaps as the series bear on, the most inconsistent theme of mashed potato in the show, the viscosity of the product goes from a malleable material, as one would expect in a plate of bangers and mash, to something more akin to a banana smoothie.
Like muck. And that kind of brings back memories for me in terms of, I know at least in the first series he's working as a chef. Edgar, would you like to enlighten the viewers as to how he secured that role?
I think this is a very pivotal moment. Really sets the tone for the entire show. This constant will to seek stable employment, and his capacity to do so in certain roles. For instance, in season 1, he wins a job as a chef in a local restaurant after sculpting a football of mashed potato alongside his badger familiar. for a group of football fans, and they really appreciate the dish. Who was he in the competition with?
I do believe it was a Frenchman or a supposed Frenchman,
Yeah.
perhaps a caricature of a Frenchman. I definitely remember a stripy shirt and perhaps a baguette, large chef's hat. We'll kind of never know whether he was a Frenchman or not. That's kind of gone to the grave with Cunningham, of course. But
I think this is one of the roles where he could truly flourish. His almost dangerous urge to involve mashed potato in every sphere of his existence could be capitalised upon in
Yeah.
a role in a local restaurant.
yeah, I mean, I remember the looks on the football lads' faces. They were so made up, so happy to see that mashed potato football. And of course he won. He won by a mile. That
Yeah.
Frenchman was trying to whip up something, quite
La-di-da.
la-di-da. And these are a group of football lads. They didn't want that. They wanted a mashed potato football.
Despite his success, the self-sabotage begins before Bodger has even won this job as a chef, due to the virtue of the fact that he thought it appropriate to arrive at a job interview for a job that he clearly wanted, with a badger stuffed in a sports bag.
Yeah, I mean, of the animals as well, it's arguably one of Britain's most aggressive, I would say, as
Certainly.
well. And certainly wild. Probably, you shouldn't have any animal in a kitchen. And of the animals that you would choose to bring, probably one of the worst you could choose.
And I would wish to extend that by, of all the badgers you'd wish to bring into a food preparation area, you wouldn't want a badger that is so badly behaved, and a badger that has such an obsession with mashed potato.
Yeah, such an unusual dietary choice. I really, I've never seen. I thought they kind of lived off insects. I'm not I'm not an expert by any means, but I know they typically wouldn't be eating smash or some sort of cheap knockoff version of an instant mashed potato in the wild. At least even in the zoo, I don't think they'd give it to that.
Of course, this poorly behaved badger led to Simon Bodger's ultimate dismissal from this role as a chef. So there he was, unemployed once again. But fortunately, he was able to find work at a local primary school.
I know it was a janitorial role. What was the name of the primary school again, Edna?
It was called Lesby Avenue Primary School, and as you say, he was initially hired as a janitor. However, due to safeguarding concerns, he was moved into the canteen to work as a dinner lady.
Yeah, I believe they wanted more eyes on him, and they wanted him away from a lot of the sort of the larger mechanical tools that he was using in quite a dangerous way, and a lot of them really aren't compatible with mashed potato either.
No.
So, I think despite it being a concerning thing, I think he was a lot happier, as was Badger. In a kitchen-based role, because once again, like as we've always said, if there is a means for him to submit to his urges and inject large amounts of mashed potato into his sort of daily life, his working life, it's one of those things. Like they all say, if you love your job, you never have to work a day in your life. And I think for him, mashed potato being injected to his job really. It was his hobby, it was his passion, and unfortunately, from a psychological perspective, I'd say it was something perhaps a bit deeper, and perhaps an addiction issue.
Yes.
It's an overwhelming urge, a tendency to always revert to the mash. The mash comes first. Employment comes, goes. He's kind of always drifting, and we've only mentioned 2 bits of his CV. And he's always sort of sabotaging through the mash. I know that much.
Yeah, I think that he was finally happy when he was moved to his role as dinner lady.
Yeah.
Although, with his happiness came one true victim, and I believe that those were the students and the pupils at Lesby Avenue Primary School.
Yeah, I know we have to remember this is pre-Jamie Oliver. So I know a lot of, I mean, just kind of looking back through the series, especially those ones where he's working as a din lady, lots of mash.
Occasionally some peas.
Yeah, but I feel like it was just because it was easily flung.
I concede your point. I think that during his tenure as dinner lady at Lesby Avenue Primary School, the number of grams of protein served to the pupils there could be counted on a single hand, and therefore one must worry about an entire generation of pupils at Lesby Avenue Primary School, as they must have been severely malnourished.
Yeah. I mean, we could argue this, amongst other antics, were the sort of things that led to the termination of his role. I believe it was the Board of Governors that got involved. There was definitely parental complaints, malnourishment.
Certainly a lack of variety.
Yeah, I know as much as the children were suffering, we could argue that Simon Bodger's role as a din lady was arguably the peak of his career. How many series was it?
I believe it was 4 seasons, and that was certainly the longest job he held down. I think I would certainly concede your point. I would even go so far to say as that during his tenure at Lesby Avenue Primary School, Simon Bodger was riding high on a creamy crest of mashed potato.
Yeah, and there's certainly always a smile, less of this kind of self-sabotaging behaviour. I mean, there's still that kind of element I'm seeing as a psychologist, but
the relationship between he and Badger is a lot more collaborative in a kitchen environment.
Yeah, I think it's because they can easily fix their sort of urges they have, their desires, their cravings, you could say, for the mash.
And it's more, and the flinging of mashed potato over the face of reception-aged or Key Stage 1 aged pupils is easily disguised through their own poor table manners.
Yes, exactly. I think a lot of the parents just thought it was another child when that had happened, or perhaps they spilled it.
An accidental spillage.
Yeah,
yes.
Lots of that, you know. Yeah, and unfortunately, as we know and as we've spoken about, he did these kind of antics, the flinging, all that sort of business. It did lead to his termination of the role, and it's quite sad, obviously, but Edgar, would you like to enlighten me as to his next job role?
Well, of course. At this point in season 5, there is a clear and meaningful departure from not only Lesby Avenue but from kitchen work in general. No longer the chef at the local restaurant, no longer the dinner lady of Lesby Avenue, but instead a leafletier come tourist information clerk in a local kiosk.
Yeah. I remember it quite well.
At this point, we really are introduced to a very visceral but very clear opponent, his boss, this tourist information lady.
Yeah. And, once again, despite being without a kitchen, he is somehow injecting mashed potato with his animal familiar,
Yes.
Badger.
Certainly through the perspective of the audience that we see Bodger and Badger as protagonists. Had they not introduced mashed potato at every strata of their life, perhaps there would have been a more collegiate relationship between Bodger and the tourist information lady.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe it was sort of legal reasons that she couldn't immediately fire him. I think he'd been sort of hired off a job seekers scheme
Possibly.
at the time, so they had to keep him on for a few months at least, just so he'd get a bit of experience, a bit of training, all this sort of thing. Kind of terminally unemployed character that just needed a bit of help, and she was happy to do that. But
and like a ladle full of viscous mashed potato, he threw it back in her face.
You make a very good point there, Edgar, in terms of the viscosity is a very key thing we see, sort of perhaps representing a decline in his mental health as it goes from a firm football, as we've mentioned in the first series, for the football lads, as we mentioned.
In Lesby Avenue, it is used to sculpt a statue, a replica of the headmistress.
Yeah, I remember it very well. They even sort of decorated it in a way that it wasn't all
painted.
Beige. It was painted. Yeah, it was.
So this is clearly a very pliable substance.
Yeah.
However, once he moves to the Tourist Information Centre, how does it change there?
If I remember correctly, there's a thermos, and it's almost like a sort of wallpaper paste, you'd say, just kind of this sloppy liquid. That at this stage he's just flinging it. I don't think anyone's eating it at this stage. It's not even. I wouldn't consider it food. Perhaps a drink.
Sadly, this is Simon Bodger's final foray in the workforce. For in the final seasons of Bodger and or Badger, Simon Bodger, or the entire show is set in a landlady's lodgings.
Yeah, you'd perhaps describe him as an unemployed tenant, a lodger maybe.
Paying his rent seemingly through various odd jobs and favours in the house.
Certainly some of it seems to be handyman work with a side of mashed potato sort of hijinks. We've also alluded to the fact that, he had a landlady. Some of these things might have been sexual. We don't know.
When you need a roof over your head,
you'll do anything, I guess.
Yeah. However, I think this really underlines the fact that this entire piece of work depends on Simon Bodger being this vulnerable,
certainly,
and expendable worker.
Yeah, certainly from a Marxist perspective, I would say proletariat. Very much disposable labour. He's kind of shifts from job to job, kind of meaningless.
No
cast
hope.
away.
No hope to ever own a home, as the final season suggests.
Yeah.
And clearly eating a very meagre diet of mashed potato.
Yeah, and certainly instant mash. We know that much. I believe Smash, or perhaps a cheaper brand, a name non-name brand, I believe.
Now the thing is, of course, so much of the subtext of Bodger and Badger is of Simon Bodger being this disgraced and disenfranchised worker. However, it does feel as though his actions lead to these consequences, and each one of his dismissals depends upon the fact that he was not able to resist his relentless obsession for mashed potato.
I believe that's completely true. Despite operating in a capitalist society and him being a sort of lower paid worker,
cog.
Essentially a cog, yeah. He also does sabotage him, so he does himself no favours, let's be honest.
As we can see, there's this ever-present trend that Simon Bodger is always in conflict with women.
Yeah, so I know with his landlady, and we've kind of touched upon this a little bit, but it was kind of a poisonous relationship. And generally speaking, I would say he was always kind of having a poisonous relationship with women in positions of authority, I would say.
Like the landlady, as you say, like the headmistress of Lesby Avenue Primary School, and of course the tourist information lady.
Yeah, seemingly Simon Bodger is the catalyst for said toxicity, I would say, and chiefly due to his MASH-related antics and also his mischievous badger companion, I would say.
I think that is perfectly true, and I think that a lot of this vilification of women stems from perhaps a semi-autobiographical reference to Cunningham's own life, whereby he continued and failed to woo one Miss Jane Bassett, who was a long-time contributor to the show, best known for her reprisals of Millie the Milkmaid, and perhaps more famously, long-time favourite of the show, the puppet Mousy.
Yes. I believe there's also an incident that kind of happens with the tourist information lady.
I think this really highlights this strained and frustrated romantic narrative as the tourist information lady subjects Simon Bodger's genitalia to a high-pressure hose,
Yeah.
which is, I'm sure you would agree, from your psychoanalytical perspective, is clearly a symbol of his own emasculation.
Yes, certainly. I do remember it very well when it happened.
A mad cuckoldry that is presented on screen for children to absorb. It's quite a dangerous proposition, don't you think?
I would agree, certainly.
Interestingly, during this aquatic mock castration, the badger is not present, which really leads us on to something quite fruitful from your camp.
Yeah, from a psychological perspective, one thing that I've certainly noticed rewatching all the series of Bodger and Badger, I've certainly noticed when there's hijinks happening, the badger represents kind of a loss of control, kind of like a devil on his shoulder, certainly. And you never really see the angel on his shoulder. A lot of the times it's always just him being sort of dragged down by this devilish badger, arguably one of the more aggressive animals.
Certainly. You could argue there's only a badger on his shoulder.
Certainly. And, from a psychological perspective, there's certainly, no one is mitigating his behaviour. He's sort of given these roles and always sabotaging himself. We have to look at the fact that perhaps, certainly from a psychological perspective and a psychoanalytic perspective, perhaps there was issues with a mother, harking back to what we've mentioned in terms of this sort of largely chauvinist behaviour,
Yes.
Always butting heads with a woman in authority.
This mother role.
Yeah, certainly. And
I think the same can be said for the viscosity of the mashed potato itself. I don't want to flog a dead horse here. However, the fact that the mashed potato relents throughout the seasons from a solid to a liquid, almost milk-like state, I dare say this is a replacement for the mother's milk.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you there, Edgar. Very valid point. We're starting off, and he's always, as you say, permeates the mashed potato throughout all of the series. It's kind of like a mashed potato crutch, I would say. He's certainly, Simon Bodger is certainly a lonely man. We never see a family member. Do you see a family member?
No.
I don't recall
which would chime with this lack of a maternal figure, or certainly a very tattered and burnt bridge between the two of them.
Yeah, you could argue that they were, throughout the show, burning bridges and then dousing them in mashed potato throughout.
Systematically, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about his CV constantly, even when he was doing his favourite job as a dinner lady. Once again, burnt that bridge. It was very sad, and you could argue when the Badger's present, he's often operating in kind of a fugue state. Perhaps he's not in control. He's not sort of cognitively there,
Yes.
I would say.
He's clearly lacking in some of those basic steps in cognitive development.
I know certainly there isn't sort of any level of behavioural inhibition. He gets an idea in his head, throw mashed potato at that lady, and he immediately does it. These are sort of things we develop during adolescence into early adulthood. You know, that ability, you know, an idea pops into your head, you don't immediately have to do it.
You can resist. You
Yeah.
can say no.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet Simon Bodger, in this fugue state, lacking this clear sense of self and this clear sense of agency, is incapable of making the right decision.
Certainly, and it's constant. It's constant throughout all the series, really.
At this juncture, I think it would be fair to address the Badger in the room, Walter. For the listeners at home, they are not aware of your arguably unusual encounters with a certain Andrew Cunningham. Would you care to expand on this?
Yes, of course. So, I've bumped into Andrew Cunningham a few times when I was doing a bit of work at BBC Studios in White City, West London, and initially it was kind of jovial, quite friendly chats. Just I like your work. I grew up on your work, and I really enjoyed it, obviously. And then we became a bit more conversational.
Familiar?
Yeah, familiar, exactly. And I'd sometimes bump into him in the canteen. And I remember one situation very vividly where I kind of spoke to him about the MASH and asked him, why are you always the packet? You're always on the packet. And I showed him, I went behind the canteen and I showed him a potato. And he looked at me, kind of a look of shock, maybe a bit of anger, I might say, quite aggressive at least. And he thought it was a passion fruit when I showed him this potato. And I had to explain to him that, no, this is a potato. You can boil this, you can mash it, and it will become mashed potato. You don't have to rely on this processed kind of muck he uses. And I popped it in his back pocket as kind of a little safekeeping thing. And at which point, as I said, this kind of aggression, he became very dysregulated, kind of tried to swing for me. There was arms flailing, and luckily there was security there. They managed to kind of hold him back, and he had to be restrained. It was quite upsetting. It was... I hope, when he got home, he perhaps used that potato, or at least looked into how it can be used.
The unfortunate part that we should mention is that Andrew Cunningham sadly passed away in 2017, and the good die young, and
we know that. Yeah.
I remember you telling me all those years ago that you hoped that maybe he went to the grave with that potato in his back pocket.
Yeah, certainly. Even, perhaps not physically, but metaphorically.
Yeah.
It was always there as a reminder, I believe. I mean...
It's certainly a very troubling proposition to think that this unhealthy reliance on mashed potatoes seeped not only through his work but into his own life.
And
I think that really leaves us at this a very challenging disagreement between Walter and I, where our readings of this show violently conflict with one another. Walter, would you care to expound on your point?
Yeah, I mean, coming from a psychological perspective, I do believe that Badger is just perhaps a representation of his overactive id. You know, we only ever see Badger there when there's mashed potato being flung. I certainly know that much, and that's my viewpoint on it. Edgar, what's your take?
I do see great wealth and great worth in the psychoanalytical reading of Bodger and Badger. However, the agency with which the Badger affects the environment really makes me feel as though Simon Bodger took this Badger under his wing, taught it to speak English in a Cockney accent, trained it to wear a beret, and led this poor Badger into a life of mashed potato, a true dependency.
Well, I do remember when we were speaking about before the show, and there was always, as you would say, a promise of mashed potato for the Badger for being dragged along to these events.
Yes.
I mean, I can't imagine a Badger would want to be in a kitchen.
No. I can't imagine a Badger would want to be in a tourist information kiosk. I wouldn't imagine a Badger would like to rent out a room in a semi-detached suburban setting.
No, not at all. I mean, they're largely nocturnal, I do understand, and this is always during the daytime that this is happening, isn't it?
He's against nature and he's against biology at this point.
Yeah, and for me, that's one of the points that would lead me to believe it's the Badger is essentially a figment of his imagination, Simon Bodger's imagination, I would say.
I think it's certainly up for debate, and I'm sure we'll come back to this in future conversations. However, there's one point of concordance between the two of us, and that is whether the Badger is real or not. Both Simon Bodger and Badger are in a deeply enabling relationship with mashed potato.
Of course, yeah, and in terms of our debate, I mean, we will kind of never really know. Sadly, with the passing of Andrew Cunningham in 2017, that's kind of gone to the grave of him. I know there is so much more that we could say about his work, but unfortunately, that's all we really have time for today, isn't it, Edgar?
Yeah, that's true, Walter. So we would just like to thank our audience for listening today to Diabolic in its new podcast format. We're incredibly relieved that we're back, ready to talk about the big issues and sometimes talk about some of the smaller things as well.
True. It's nice to reminisce and look back over these shows, and I do believe
we're shining a light on these incredible cultural artifacts.
Yeah, and the people that made them, such as Andrew Cunningham. We'd like to celebrate his life and his work, and
and may he rest in peace.
Yeah.
And if there is a heaven, may he float now on a cloud of creamy mashed potato.
Yes.
Next time on Diabolic, Dick and Dumb in the Bungalow.